Our scripture this morning comes from James chapter 4, verse 11 to 5, verse 6. Brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you.
You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes.
So we've been using these little pithy sayings from the book of James as Proverbs. Now, is everybody familiar with the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament? All right, the book of Proverbs would be perfect for Twitter today. They're just little pithy sayings that are great little pieces of advice for living life. And we decided that we were going to use the book of James in this series almost as Proverbs for the church. So this is kind of an interesting one to look at, this key verse from James chapter 4, verse 14. There are probably not as many as there used to be, but are there any Syracuse football fans out there this morning? Anybody? Okay, you got one. Okay, good. Then you will all absolutely love this. Has anybody here ever heard of Ernie Davis?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad. For those of you who don't know, other than NFL and Cleveland Browns superstar and legend Jim Brown, Ernie Davis was the greatest running back in Syracuse University football history. Nicknamed the Elmira Express, he rushed for over 2,300 yards and 36 touchdowns in his college career, more than Jim Brown. He was the first African American to win the Heisman Trophy. His future as an NFL star was bright, and he was drafted by both the NFL Cleveland Browns and, at the time, the AFL Buffalo Bills. But the Browns ended up signing him for an unheard of $200,000 rookie contract. And he was set to line up in the backfield with fellow Syracuse alum Jim Brown. So why have we heard so much about Jim Brown and not all that much about Ernie Davis, unless you know Syracuse football? Well, he never played a snap in the NFL. Shortly after he was drafted, he was diagnosed with leukemia, and he died at the age of 23. What a tragedy. So much potential, so little of it realized. And yet at Syracuse, Davis's greatness reigns supreme. In the end, we're not judged on our potential, we're judged by what we've accomplished. And his statue faces the Carrier Dome, where both the football and basketball teams play. He's remembered for the greatness of what he was, not for what he could have been. It's a bittersweet story. But it's a good reminder of our key verse from James this morning on this All Saints Sunday. James chapter 4, verse 14. You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. We can be here one moment and then gone the next. So we need to take full advantage of every moment that we're given. You know, we're so far removed from death in our own time that it's almost, I think there's a sense where people feel as if they're invincible. That death isn't something that should happen to people. But death happens to all of us at all different times. All of us will die. And all of us will have our names read at some point from the communion table during an All Saints celebration. You know, the saints that we've recognized over the years, not all have been saintly, have they? Some have had character flaws. Some have done things that weren't necessarily saintly. Some were not exactly people that we would describe as outstanding Christians. They may have just showed up in church on Sunday, but their inner religious life was largely unknown to us. We recognize them as saints, though. We recognize them as members of the family of God who were faithful in their own way, whatever that may have been. Because they are our family, and they carry the legacy of our family, the good and the bad and the in-between. The passage from James this morning that was read might sound a little harsh to our ears. It might even rub us the wrong way. So let's just hear those verses again from verses 13 through 17. James writes this. He says, "Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is a sin for them." Now, what is James getting at in this passage? First, it's the whole point of the sermon title. What is your life? What is it? What's it for? What's life for? Well, the answer is that you and I were created by God for God's glory. It's a very simple way to think about life. We all make plans, though. Is that evil to make plans? Is there something wrong with trying to figure out what a well-ordered life will be? Not really. But I think what's bugging James here in this passage is that the sense that we can be great without God. Greatness without God's involvement isn't really greatness at all. God has a plan for each of our lives. He created us for His glory. He has a plan for us. A good plan. The best plan, in fact. And if we know it, and if we don't follow through on it, or if we've never searched it out, according to verse 17, we're living in a sinful way. We should search out our Creator's plans for our lives, to live the best life that we can. Now, in a similar way, James calls up the wealthy of his day, because in their thinking, their wealth granted them autonomy and independence. He says this in verses 1 through 6. "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, the moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." Now, it's unlikely that James is actually talking to the people of the church in the first century. Because the fact is, in the first century, there really just weren't that many wealthy people in the church. If you recall some earlier passages from James that we've looked at, James warns the people not to give special treatment to a wealthy person who happens to walk into a worship service. I think what James is doing in this passage is he's speaking more prophetically and generally to Roman society at large. And you know, he can be speaking to our own time and place in this passage, couldn't he? It's clear that James isn't a big fan of the wealthy. Look at the catalog of judgment he calls down on them in verses 1 through 3. And why does he call down all that judgment? Because the wealthy at the top were responsible for much of the oppressive nature of Roman society. It was a culture that served the very rich and at some point crushed everyone else. Now, why would James bother to write this? Do you think this passage really bothered the rich very much? Do you think they probably even heard about it? Probably not. They probably never read it, never reached their ears. So why does James bother to write this? Well, I think he writes this because even though the rich wouldn't have heard his message, the people of the churches that he was writing to would have heard this message. And I think, like all of us, they envied the power and wealth of the elites of society. You know, everybody wants to be rich, and James wonders why. He says, hey, these people are the source of all your troubles and all the evils in the world. Why do you want to be like them? Let's just think about the lottery industry for a second. Isn't that based on our desire and our envy of those with money to burn? Wouldn't we like to be like one of them? Wouldn't we like to be like the people we see, well, maybe sort of, in the supermarket tabloids and our social media news feeds? Wouldn't it be great to live the life of an elite in society? Not to James. James says these are the people that will be subject to the greatest judgment. Again, our key verse from James chapter 4. You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes, and our wealth vanishes with us. James has a different idea of greatness, and so I think that his advice to all of us, all the saints of the church, that's right, I'm talking to you, all the saints of the church, would be to stop saying this. Stop saying this. My life would be great if you fill in the blank. Don't we say that to ourselves every so often? When we hit a moment of discontentment, we think, my life would be great if whatever that is. Think about Ernie Davis again. At the age of 17, he was the Elmira Express. He was already great. And in the following 5 years, he proved his greatness. He wasn't great because he lived a long life. He was great because for as long as he lived, he used the gifts and talents God had given him to their maximum potential on the football field. James wants us to stop saying, my life would be great if I was more wealthy, if I were more attractive, if I were more talented. I would be great if I had gotten that job. I would be great if I lived in a different place. I would be great if I had married a different person. And on and on and on. We all say this to ourselves. I would be great if. Things would be great if. James says it's just an excuse. There's more to life than the what ifs. What is your life? Is your life a list of frustrations? Or is your life a testimony to the power of God's grace in your working, in your life? James wants us to realize that God has made us just who we are for His glory. And if that's true, if we're created just as we are for God's glory, then what does that mean? What does God have in store for us just as we are? Have you ever asked God that question? God, will you take my life just as I am and show me the way I need to go? Not the what ifs, but just as I am now. That's what God wants to do for each one of us, wants to do in our lives. God doesn't want us to live lives of significance that show up in the supermarket tabloids or on Twitter, but the kind of lives that matter in eternity, where it really counts. Because real greatness comes with living for God, for God's glory. That's where we find our full potential realized, just as we are. As our key verse reminds us, it can all be over in a minute. We don't really have all that much time to waste. So as we gather to remember the saints around the communion table this morning, let's dedicate ourselves not to what could have been, but to what is. What is your life? And let God reveal the goodness and the joy in that. In prayer and in community today, we come to allow God to feed our souls. And we ask the Lord to make the most of our lives however they are, in such a way that our lives will be submitted to Him for His glory, because that's what it's all about.